Carter's got to, but I need to take a moment before beginning to say, oh yes. Oh, that was an amazing piece of music and very touching, deeply. There you are, Iris. Thank you. So we've just welcomed new members to our congregation, and I'd like to take a serious moment together with you to consider for each of us what it means to belong, to be a part of this congregation. And when I teach the history segments of our new UU gathering, I talk about how in the beginnings of times, the very original religious experiences in human prehistory occurred when members of the tribe, members of the clan, members of the nation would gather around a communal fire and tell stories. And out of those stories, they would find and make meaning. Some of those findings and meanings would be individual, and some of them would be very communal. And we tell stories from week to week so that we might find our place in them, find our place in this world. And so I have 4 stories for you this morning that I'd like to look at for a moment. And the first one is the story that you just heard, the story of the loaves and the fishes. So there's how many? 2 fish and 5 loaves? And by the way, I had to change the language at the end of that because during March National Women's Month, I couldn't say, and 5,000 men besides women and children were fed. I couldn't do that, but I figured it was very safe to estimate the crowd at least 10,000 people. So we had that estimate there. And now I've told you where it came from. So we have the story of the loaves and the fishes, and for most of the Bible stories, especially ones that I find any value in, and this is one that I find particular value in, I think of a definition for mythology by Robert A. Johnson, a rather renowned mythologist, who says that a myth is something that is not necessarily true on its outside, but is true on the inside. And I think that the story of the loaves and the fishes, for me at least, falls into that category. And so I would like to put it to you for a moment. Does anybody have a sense of what took place on that mountainside? Okay, so just to recap the highlights of the story. Jesus is out there teaching after John the Baptist was just killed, by the way. I mean, that's what happens immediately before this story. And he's distraught, and he tries to go away by himself, but this crush of people follow him, and he finds himself on the mountainside, and he's holding forth, and the apostles are concerned about it getting late and people not being able to eat, and somebody says, well, we've got these 2 fish and we've got these 5 loaves, and Jesus says, don't send them home, we have to feed them. So bring me the food that we have. So he blesses this food, and then they start to distribute it, and over 10,000 people are fed. So anybody have a sense of what's going on there? Judith?
People share. People have the bread stashed away in the bag, and they pull it out and share it, and it's people nice.
I don't know if you could hear Judith, but she said people shared. When people began to give those first 2 loaves and first 2 fish and the 5 loaves, when people saw that other people were going to share what they brought, they knew that they could share what they brought, and that everybody could. So it wasn't the hocus pocus that maybe some of us were led to think of earlier in our lives. That where I grew up, it was Jesus turned the 2 fish and the 5 loaves into thousands of fish and thousands of loaves. And there's nothing even in the text that says he turned it. What it says is he blessed it. Ellen?
Yeah, okay. I think it's an allegory for spiritual hunger and thirst. And I think that the people all came there without any faith in themselves or the world or anything, and that Christ gave them that faith. And the way you speak about it is that you talk about the fishes and the bread. but it was an experience of faith. It had nothing to do with food or drink.
Oh, I have to disagree. Yes, it's an experience of faith, and I agree with that whole part of your assessment, but those people had to eat, too. And they were going to eat by the sharing of food. So absolutely, and you know, you couldn't have added to the story more than to say, it wasn't just the food, it was the spiritual nurturing that took place there, too. And here's the thing, how many of you have been to potluck suppers in your lives? Okay, and you make your best dish and you take it to the potluck supper, right? So that when people get around to sharing food in that kind of a manner, what do you get? You get the best stuff.
Awesome.
You get the best food. And maybe it's not all ethical, but we're working. We're working in that direction. And so I've got a feeling that upcoming potlucks here will certainly be more ethical. But the thing is you get really good food. So putting that back into the allegory, Ellen, that you just raised, is not only are you getting really tasty, scrumptious something to eat for your body, but you're getting the best of what we have to offer one another spiritually, in terms of being fed in spirit and in soul. So I'll leave you with that one on the loaves and the fishes. But the next story is really one of very recent history here in our congregation, and you've heard me talk about it very briefly, and I'm only going to talk about it briefly again. But that is the budget initiative that we just had in December, and you followed through while I was away in January. And okay, I want you to be thinking loaves and fishes here, okay? Because what happened is that Nick Lewis, our president, and I approached some members of the congregation and we said, we have, and there are official numbers and there are other numbers, but in our congregation we have probably somewhere from 700 to 800 people. We have 700 to 800 people in this congregation that need to be fed by our community. Oh yes, Colin, it is 700 to 800, and I'll tell you about it. Colin, our treasurer, said that. We have 250 kids in our Sunday school, and we have lots of folks who are on breakfast. But that aside, it doesn't matter. Let's say it's 400 people. Let's say it's 500, 600. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we have a lot of people here who come for that very spiritual nurturance that you were talking about, as well as coffee hour. And so we went to the folks and we said, and we don't have enough to support this. Can we count on you for a major contribution that will allow us to establish a pool that can be matched then by the rest of the congregation? And lo, the congregation responded, and we reached the level that we needed to reach in order for us to have a year that's in the black. And so we have an ancient story of loaves and fishes, and we have a very modern congregational story that mirrors it in many ways. Okay, so since then, I would just point out there have been a rash of yeses that have broken out in the congregation. Just quite recently, I spoke with Ed Boyle and Mike Shapiro and said, we need to turn to you to be our pledge drive chairs for this year. And both of them immediately responded yes. Laurie Alexander, someone who just became a new member in the last time that we welcome new people. Many of you know Penny McNaughton is getting more frail and can no longer do the Sunday flowers that we have. And I called Laurie and said, can you do this? And she said, it took her maybe a second, maybe 2 seconds to answer. Literally no more than that. Oh, I'd love to do that, Charlie. And those kinds of yeses have broken out all over. People are stepping forward in ways that are enabling all of us to make this the kind of rich and nurturing congregation that we want and that we can be when we are the ones that fulfill the want that we have. In a conversation this week, I remembered one of my favorite stories that maybe some of you have heard me tell before, but there's a story of this is back in olden Eastern days, and there's the story of a person moving into a new village and from another village, and there's a bodhisattva who lives in this village. A bodhisattva is a very wise person who is at the last level before becoming a Buddha, and so we're talking megawatts.